Hi everyone, this is Dr. Jenkins. We are scooting right along because here we are already with the neuromuscular considerations chapter. So before this, we did the skeletal, the bones and the muscles. And I think sometimes people don't consider the neuromuscular component. Let's remember that in order for a muscle to contract, we have to give that muscle a nerve impulse. So the nerves and the muscles have to work together. So it's really quite important. Maybe I can use yellow for this one. Important. But sometimes we don't talk about it as much. So let's make sure we talk about it. Okay, you already know the functions of the nervous system. We know that it sends nerve impulses to and from the brain, and that the brain and the spinal cord are able to do some processing. It usually happens in this order. Make sure you remember that, and this is a little bit later in your notes here, sensory or afferent. You need to know these folks. Sensory or afferent are nerve impulses that are sent from the body to the brain. So from the periphery to the brain. Then the brain will process information based on what sensory nerve impulses it receives. And then in order to carry out effects in the body, the brain will initiate motor or efferent. And please know both terms, right? Motor or efferent impulses back from the brain back out to the body. You know, it's easy to think of these examples like maybe there's a sensory nerve impulse coming from the stomach because the stomach is empty. So a sensory nerve impulse will be sent from the empty stomach to the brain, which triggers you to be hungry, and then you eat, right? And then we have to send motor impulses back out to the stomach to help churn as we just have introduced food into the stomach. So I think sometimes those examples are easier, but these are also happening with muscles. Just for the heck of it, I'm drawing a muscle, a skeletal muscle. So we have, go a little lighter color here. You know, the nerve comes down from the brain. It's my brain. The nerve impulse comes out from the brain. And it has little tendrils that go to the muscle. And remember, the muscle and the tendon, by the way, so we could come to the muscle tendon, we're sending nerve impulses in both directions. We know that we're sending motor impulses out to the muscle, but we're constantly sending nerve impulses from the muscle to the brain, talking about its muscle or tendon position, how much stretch, how much pressure. So I just want to remind you that we send nerve impulses both ways, even to muscles. Make sure you review the basic structure of the nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. The central nervous system is where we do more of the processing. Here it says integrative and control, but what that really means is processing. So the brain and spinal cord are the only parts of the body, are the only parts of the nervous system capable of processing, which means that everything else is part of the peripheral nervous system. These are all the nerves that make up our nervous system outside the brain and spinal cord. And this is really only going to function to send nerve impulses. There's no processing happening in your femoral nerve, right? There's no processing happening in your peripheral nerves. They're just pathways to deliver nerve impulses to and from the body. The only processing is happening in the central nervous system. Okay, so you've already had this basic anatomy. What I want to do is I want to point out some important things that are going to come up in our discussion later. Okay, let me just see what pictures we have here. Okay. Of importance in the central nervous system. Of importance here is the first and foremost, well, I guess there's really We need all of them, so one's not more important than the other. But we have the cerebellum. This is going to be so important. Make sure you review where it is. It's on the posterior aspect of the brain. Kind of looks like a big thing of cauliflower. What is the function of the cerebellum? We may remember it has to do with posture, our ability to maintain posture, but also, more importantly for our discussion, motor skills. Our ability to coordinate different muscles at the same time together, along with taking into consideration cues that are visual or auditory or other sensory cues. The ability to bring in other information from the brain about memory, which includes muscle memory. So the cerebellum is going to be a big processing place for motor skills. The cerebellum is going to be a big processing place for motor skills. Also of importance is the cerebrum. That's this wormy part out here. So really, all of this, folks, is the cerebrum, the only voluntary part of our brain. Of particular importance to us, you may remember from anatomy and physiology, the primary motor cortex. This is where motor impulses out to the body are generated from. So this is the part of the cerebral cortex that generates motor impulses to skeletal muscle. This is not where we generate motor nerve impulses to smooth and cardiac muscle. No. This is where we generate motor impulses to skeletal, which is our only voluntary type of muscle. So if I voluntarily want to contract my biceps brachii, where is that motor impulse coming from? The primary motor cortex. So the cerebrum and the cerebellum are going to be two things that are really important. Of course, they're all important, but I'm just trying to point out some. In the periphery, we rely on our spinal nerves. Our spinal nerves are all these nerves coming out, and these nerves will have branches that feed everything. Again, these are the nerves that are going to transmit nerve impulses out to the body and from the body back to the brain. And of course, the spinal cord is our superhighway for that. So nerve impulses go up towards the brain, nerve impulses come down to the brain, and then maybe out to the body. Quick reminder, the cranial nerves are also considered part of the peripheral nervous system. Even though they're close to the brain, they're not actually in the brain. So therefore, the cranial nerves, because they're technically outside of the brain, are still considered part of the peripheral nervous system. I already talked about afferent and afferent sensory neurons and nerve impulses, motor or efferent neurons and nerve impulses. Make sure you review those. Make sure you can define a myotome. You don't need to know all these, folks. You don't need to know all those. But please know the definition. A myotome is a nerve that innervates a muscle. So for example, the myotome for deltoid is the axillary nerve. It got cut off here. Let me use a different color. The nerve that innervates the muscle, the deltoid, is our C5 nerve, also known as the axillary. So we can actually, you don't need to know the specific muscles, but we can actually map it out. Look at this cool picture. It's showing on this side, this is the area of the arm and shoulder that is supplied by the nerve, the peripheral motor nerve, leaving from C5, between the C4 and C5 vertebrae. Right? What about the triceps, the posterior part of the posterior part of the arm? Well, that's going to be a branch off of C6 and C7, which goes on to become the radial nerve. So each muscle has a nerve going into it. And for a particular muscle, the myotome is the nerve that innervates that muscle. So for each muscle, it's a different myotome, a different nerve. Good. So you don't need to know the nerves, just know the definition. Okay. Sometimes I like to throw in some random pictures. Here is a cadaver shoulder. I just wanted to point out, this is one particular area where we have a whole bunch of nerves. I'm going to go back to a couple of slides ago, right here. What we're looking at is this network of nerves right here. It's called the brachial plexus. It starts here, but then it comes down. It's a big network of nerves. It's pretty superficial. If you've ever heard of a stinger or a burner in a sport like football, if you get a stretch where your head goes one way and your arm goes the other, it stretches these nerves and you can have numbness and tingling down the arm. So they're so superficial. But look at all these nerves, folks. Let me go with orange. Look at all these nerves, right? Look at how thick they are. Look at this thick nerve. And then it branches with this one, branches over here. These are all nerves that are going to go to supply skeletal muscle. I can even see this branch down here going into the muscle. Right, that's the pectoralis major. I can see this one going into the latissimus dorsi. I think a lot of people are surprised with how thick these nerves are. It's no joke, but they're really important. All right. I wanted to include a picture of a neuron just to remind you, right? I don't really see this on your notes right now, but if we're talking about the nervous system, how can I not mention the neuron? This is the main nerve cell of the nervous system. Neurons have a kite-shaped cell body with dendrites or little extensions coming off of them, the dendrites. And then there's one long tail called an axon. Cool. Just make sure you review the basics. All right. Now we're going to begin our discussion on, if you can see Roman numeral number 2, we're going to begin our discussion on sensory receptors. So right now I'm only talking about sensory. So we're talking about information. If I draw my little brain here, there's the brain connected to the spinal cord. Right now we're talking only about sensory nerves, which means that we have neurons out in the body, and they're going to transmit nerve impulses from the periphery of the body up the spinal cord to the brain. So we're talking about sensory or afferent neurons and nerve impulses. So let's just first address that. We're going to be addressing sensory or afferent nerves and nerve impulses. Well, what is the point of sending information from the body back to the brain? We're constantly sending information to the brain about what's going on in the body. Let me just go back. Let's get a new picture going here. So remember, if I draw my brain, I really can't draw for crap, as you know, and my spinal cord going all the way down, right? Maybe out in the periphery we have the skin. Maybe I have skeletal muscles over here. So we're talking about sensory nerves. We're talking about sensory nerves that send information from the body back towards the spinal cord, up the spinal cord to the brain. The purpose of these sensory or afferent nerve impulses, the purpose of these is to constantly be letting the brain know what's going on in the body. The point is to constantly be letting the brain know what's going on in the body. You know how when I repeat things are important, right? The function is to constantly be letting the brain know what's going on in the body. It could be information from the skin. For example, if we're looking on the notes, Roman numeral 2, sensory receptors, and then letter A. Don't we need to be telling the brain about pain? If you have a cut on your skin, the only way that you're going to know about it, quote unquote, is if there's a sensory nerve impulse from the skin to the brain. It could be about temperature, right? It could be about skin temperature. It could be about core temperature. Maybe you have a fever. Cold, pressure. So we have all these more general sensory receptors that are constantly sending information to the brain. There are some that are considered exteroreceptors that are more to the surface of the skin, like the skin or the ear or the nose. And then there's interoreceptors, which are deep inside, like in the stomach or in a muscle. But you don't need to know exteroreceptors versus interoreceptors. You don't need to know exteroreceptors versus interoreceptors. We are going to begin our discussion of a specific type of receptor related to muscles called proprioceptors. So we're going to focus on a specific type of receptor known as a proprioceptor. Proprioceptors or proprioceptors. Now, these are specialized receptors. They're sensory receptors, which means that they're going to sense for something and then send information to the spinal cord and brain. These are specialized receptors that sense for changes in body position and or stretch. These are specialized receptors that sense for changes in body position and or stretch. Did you get that? Specialized receptors that sense for changes in body position and or stretch. We're going to be talking about two of them, a muscle spindle and a Golgi tendon organ. I have made a lovely review table for you. This is what you need to know. Two examples of proprioceptors. So these are types of proprioceptors because these are things that sense for changes in body position or stretch. And these are located in the muscle. Kinesiology is about the study of movement. How do we move? Skeletal muscle. So we're talking about proprioceptors in the muscle. All right. You probably have heard of these, okay? But they're so important. And we'll discuss why. So the muscle spindle. This is a type of receptor, and it is located in the muscle belly. So I'm going to use, let's see, what color can I use for the muscle spindle? What about green? So our muscle spindle is a specialized receptor, sensory receptor, located in the muscle belly. If I go back here, we can see a picture. Here's a picture of a muscle. The muscle spindles are located in the muscle belly. Wrapped around these muscle fibers are specialized receptors called muscle spindles. You don't need to know intrafusal, extrafusal, gamma. You don't need to know that. We're just identifying that in the muscle belly, in addition to the muscle fibers and the actin and the myosin and all that. In addition to that, we have specialized receptors called muscle spindles. There technically are some intrafusal muscle spindles and extrafusal muscle spindles, but you don't need to know that. You don't need to know that. What we care about is what they're sensitive to, meaning what is it that these receptors are constantly sensing? The only job in the life of a muscle spindle The only job in the life of a muscle spindle is to constantly assess changes in muscle length. Another way of saying that is stretch. The only job of a muscle spindle is to constantly sense for changes in muscle length. That's it. And your muscle spindles are constantly sensing this muscle length if you're sitting down, statically, but also as you're moving. And folks, the reason why we have these is all about protection. Why do we have pain receptors? So that if there's some horrific gash on your arm, we want the brain to be notified. So these sensory receptors are all about protection. They've got to let the brain know what's going on in the body. And it's no different for the muscles. I know we don't think about it that way, but they need to be protected too. Isn't it possible to overstretch a muscle? If I overstretch a muscle, it could just rip. So we have to have these built-in protective mechanisms to make sure that if a muscle is stretched beyond its ability to withstand it, we have to have these receptors that can let the brain know. So as such, if there's too much of an increase in length, and that's the example we're giving here, if length increases too much, we know that the muscle can handle some stretch. We know that it can be extended and it can recoil. We know that it's a little bit elastic in that way. It's contractile, it can be extended. But of course, there's a limit to structurally how much the muscles can stretch. So these muscle spindles are constantly sensing the muscle length. And if the muscle length becomes too great, if it's stretched too much, the muscle spindles will cause the muscle to contract. So the response, if this muscle begins to stretch too much, it's a negative feedback mechanism. If there's too much stretch, the muscle spindle is going to be activated, tells the brain, notifies the brain, and then the brain is going to trigger a contraction. When a muscle contracts, it shortens. So if our initial problem is that the muscle length is too long, dangerously stretched, we actually want to contract it because that will shorten it and prevent it from tearing. So the function is all about protecting the muscle from overstretching. The muscle spindle, its function is to protect the muscle from overstretching. Protects the muscle from overstretching. Okay. All right. You can see on there, while we're still talking about muscle spindles, something called a stretch reflex. One example of this is the patellar tendon reflex. You know, when you go to the doctor and they use the reflex hammer to hit your patellar tendon, what is the response? Your quad contracts to extend your leg, yes. Well, this is technically an example. Excuse me. This is technically an example of the muscle spindles being activated. I know it doesn't feel this way, but let me just explain it. What color can I use? Let me use orange. If this muscle is stretched too much, so when your knee is flexed, because this muscle attaches on your tibia, if you bend your knee, if you flex your knee, it's stretching this muscle. Theoretically, we could stretch this muscle too much. That would be bad because it might tear. So when we reach a certain point of stretch, the muscle spindle notices that, wait a minute, too much stretch, communicates to the spinal cord and the brain And there will be a response where we contract the muscle. Your leg kicks out to decrease the length of the muscle. But I've got two better examples. And I think everybody can relate to this. If you're in a class, hopefully not my class, if you're in a class and you're really tired and you begin to fall asleep, you know what this feels like. Or maybe you're just sitting on the couch in front of the TV or something. Your head begins to flex forward because you're falling asleep. Well, as your head begins to flex forward, the trapezius muscle is stretching. The muscle on the back is stretching. Now, what's going to happen eventually if you really do start to fall asleep? Eventually, you're going to pick your head up and be like, oh my God, I almost fell over. Well, you didn't wake up by yourself, right? What's happening is as your head begins to fall forward, more and more forward, there's more and more stretch in the trapezius, and eventually the stretch in the back becomes too great, and this muscle spindle is activated because the muscle spindle is like, wait a minute, this is an abnormal amount of stretch. It could be dangerous. So this is an example of the muscle spindles being activated because they sense too much stretch, and they will trigger a contraction of the trapezius to snap your head back. So you only wake up because of the stretch reflex. Just saying. We utilize this in sports to a lesser degree, so it's not going to be as obvious to think about, oh, I almost fell forward flat on my face. Thank God, my stretch reflex. But even in smaller motions, so just think about it as you're trying to, think of a soccer player, running around trying to keep their position in space. There could be such a thing where, think of a better example. Hold on. Think of like a wrestler, I guess. I don't know. But a wrestler might get into a position where one of his muscles or her muscles is being overstretched. And it may not have to be to failure and you just like say, oh my God, it's way too much stretch, and you just completely relax and get pinned. It doesn't always have to be that drastic of a reaction, but these muscle spindles might be activated and you might be like, oh shit, I need to change position. So these are always working, even if it's not such a drastic example. Something else on your sheet there is reciprocal inhibition. And we're going to talk about this more when we get to reflexes. But all I want to say here is that reciprocal inhibition. Let's go with the green. My pen is about to die. I'm just going to charge it while I'm talking to you. Reciprocal inhibition. This just means that in this example, in this picture here of the stretch reflex where the quadriceps are contracted, when the muscle spindles trigger contraction of a muscle, the opposing muscle group relaxes. That's what reciprocal inhibition is. So in this case, if the stretch reflex is triggered in this patellar tendon reflex, the quads contract, right? My pen's going to work now. The quads contract, but the opposing muscle group has to relax. We know that because we already talked about agonist and antagonist relationships. It's also true even in a stretch reflex, which is involuntary. But when a muscle spindle triggers one muscle to contract, it will also automatically inhibit the opposing muscle. That's what reciprocal inhibition is. The opposing muscle is automatically relaxed. Okay. Let's talk about the Golgi tendon organ. And I think what I want to do is we'll finish the discussion of the Golgi tendon organ, and then we're going to save the rest for lecture in person. Okay, so here's another example of a sensory proprioceptor in the muscle. What color can I use on this one? Blue? Let's use blue. Golgi tendon organ. Now, nobody should miss the location of this because it's in the name. Whereas the muscle spindles are these specialized receptors in the muscle belly, the Golgi tendon organs are in the tendons. That's why it's called Golgi tendon organ. Here's a broader picture. We already talked about the muscle spindle. Those were in the muscle belly, but now we're going to focus on the tendon. I mean, they're attached, so the muscle and tendon work together. The Golgi tendon organ are these specialized receptors, these little spiderweb looking things, specialized receptors in the tendon. What do they constantly monitor? Maybe that's a good way to think about it. What do the Golgi tendon organs constantly monitor? They monitor changes in pressure or tension, not stretch. The muscle spindles constantly monitored stretch, but the Golgi tendon organs monitor changes in pressure or tension. In other words, another way of thinking of that is load on the muscle. When we're talking about tension in the muscle, it's the load on the muscle. Think about lifting a heavy weight. The heavier weight that you lift, the more load on the muscle. A lighter weight that you're lifting doesn't put as much load, but a heavier weight puts more load. Again, these are protective. If we put too much load on a muscle, it could fail, right? And the tendon could just pop off the bone. We don't want that. So we have to have a protective mechanism, okay? So if there's too much load on a muscle, if you're trying to lift too much, if you are trying to lift too much, there's just too much load on the muscle, it can't handle it. These GTOs will be activated. They're going to sense, oh my God, that's too much load for this muscle, it can't handle it. And it will trigger the muscle to relax. So the response is muscle relaxes. That was different from the muscle spindle. In the GTO's case, if there's too much load on the muscle, you want to relax that muscle because that will remove the load right away. The example I think of with this, I'm doing a deadlift or a pec fly or whatever, and I'm lifting and my muscle just gets so fatigued. And eventually you might get to the point where you really cannot move the weight any longer. Before your muscle rips off the bone, these GTOs are going to be stimulated and you'll just end up dropping the weight. This will be a reflexive response where the GTOs will cause the muscles to relax and you'll just drop the weight. Hopefully you have a spotter there so you don't drop it on your foot or on your neck or whatever. Okay, so these are in the tendon. They constantly monitor changes in pressure or tension, which is another way of saying the load on the muscle when it's contracting. If a GTO senses too much load, it will cause a reflexive relaxation. So the function, of course, is protection. These protect the muscle from taking on too much load. And they might just tear off the bone. As an aside, something interesting about these maybe, if people, with the advent of steroids build the muscle belly. They allow you to build more actin and myosin density. But do anabolic steroids strengthen the tendon at all? Not really. So people who take steroids have to be careful. You might be increasing the muscle mass of the muscle belly, but is that tendon strong enough to handle it? Right? So how many times have we seen an NFL player completely tear a muscle, tear a biceps or a pectoralis major muscle? whether it's through steroids or not, their muscle belly might be getting too big for its britches because the attached tendon just can't handle it, right? So what good is the muscle belly if the tendon can't handle it? I'm bringing this up because all that increased load would be triggering the Golgi tendon organs. Okay, when we meet in person, we're going to cover the rest of the topics. So when we meet in person, we're going to talk about reflexes, the different types, and then motor patterns. And then we're going to talk about balance and proprioception in activity. And then, of course, we get to talk about center of gravity. I'm excited about that. And in lab, we're going to measure center of gravity. So this is a quicker one. I still need you to watch this and take notes and study. But come ready to go next time we meet in lecture.